check, 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 check. I'll just use this. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, especially those of you who have not been here before. Hopefully you know someone here. If not, you will before the night's over. We're really glad and grateful to have a full house for our first event that our racial justice team, our newly minted racial justice team, has planned for tonight. I was at last night an Indiana Humanities event that the author Timothy Egan spoke at about his book, Fever in the Heartland. It was down in Irvington, where much of his story took place. And was very impressed with the hosting and the program and Indiana Humanities and the message and the learning that we all did there. And I feel really grateful and glad to be able to offer something like that here with the help of Charla Yearwood, who you'll meet in a second. Over the last week, I've been asked many times, not coincidentally, about why I and we do this work at Cross of Grace. The we, you all, for good or ill, are an extension of what people think I do. Some of those conversations have been one-on-one. Some of those conversations have been email conversations. Some of those conversations were pretty nasty Facebook chats you might have seen. And there's lots of answers to the question about why I and we do this. One is that I have, since moving to New Palestine 22 years ago, have heard and wondered about the rumors and the reputation of our little town and how they precede us in some negative ways. I don't think that's always fair or true, but it is what it is. And I think we have a responsibility to ourselves, to each other, to our community, and especially to our kids, to try to change the narrative and learn what we can learn for ourselves and to give them a better, different story to tell about that. Another reason is that we are part of the ELCA, and mainline churches like ours are notably segregated racially, whether we like it or not, and no matter how much we preach and teach and try to proclaim otherwise, it's just true. I don't think that, I know that it's not unique to the ELCA or to churches generally, but it's something worth considering and working on, so that's another reason why we do what we do. But mostly, what motivates me most is the times over the course of the last 22 years, and especially the last 19 since I've been a father, is to have heard some of the experiences that my children have had or not had in this town, school, church, and otherwise. They've never had a black teacher, for instance, which is my first easiest way to describe how racism works systemically. I never had a black teacher or professor in all of my years in high school, elementary, college, or graduate school. That's insane. And so all this is to say there is so much work to be done. And I'm grateful that you're here to help do some of that work together. I'm really grateful for Charla Yearwood. I have no idea what she's got up her sleeve, but I trust the Indiana Humanities program and the little that we've already talked about here. Mostly, I hope all of this work is happening in a safe place tonight. Also a place where we can be so safe, we're not afraid to challenge ourselves and each other about what we might be called to wrestle with. And ultimately, the goal is that all of this, tonight and otherwise, where anti-racism work is concerned, will move us to do justice more faithfully, to be more loving and kind and merciful in faithful ways, and to walk humbly as God's people who have much work to do with the rest of our siblings, and neighbors in the world. So let's welcome, if you're a guest here and you need to use the restroom, you can go out those doors and go left. If you need to use a family restroom or a gender-neutral restroom, you can go right and walk a little further down, and you'll find that there. There's a nursery around and available, so I'm glad maybe some of you dropped off kids already. Other than that, help yourself if and when you need to drinks and cookies and coffee and cider. And let's give Charla a round of applause to welcome her for the evening.
Did I turn it off? Oh, it's on. It's on. Okay, I'm going to be honest with y'all. I'm not doing these heels this whole time. Hi, I'm Charla. I use she, her pronouns. Today we're going to talk about It's Not You, It's Me, reframing our understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before I jump all the way in that, I'll give you guys a little bit of an introduction to who I am. So like I said, I'm Charla. I am a social worker by trade. So something that maybe a lot of people don't know is that most therapists in the United States are social workers. So I am a social worker and a therapist. And one of the reasons that I'm a social worker, or why I came to the profession, is that social work really tries to look at people and environment. It's this idea of systems theory. So we don't treat an individual person from the place of just that individual person, but we try to understand where that individual person falls in the whole of society and understand them in the context of the whole society. So you're going to see some of that in the ways that I kind of present and talk about information today. I also own a therapy practice, a group practice in Indianapolis, Connected in Community. It's at 71st and Benford, if anybody's around Indianapolis. And we really focus on providing anti-oppressive therapy practices. So that's kind of my specialty. What my skill set is I am a social worker, researcher, therapist who really teaches people how to do anti-oppressive therapy practices. So I've got a lot of information I got to cram into an hour, so just bear with me. I'm going to try to talk fast, but just for the purpose of getting it all out there. Anti-oppressive therapy practices, what that looks like, what that means is, like, usually when we hear a statistic like queer folks are more likely to die by suicide, a lot of people usually land at like, so what's wrong with queer folks? But the type of therapy that our practice really grounds itself in and understands is that there's not anything wrong with queer people as to why they're dying by suicide more often. It's the reality and the context of the world that is not inclusive of queer people that lead to them dying by suicide more often. And so we help and support people from a place of they're not broken and there's not something wrong with them, but they are trying to deal with the real reality of the world around them, and how can we support them and help them navigate the realities of that world. Does that make sense? I root all of my work in Black liberation. I, again, never know who I'm coming to talk to. And that might sound like, okay, so if you're focused on Black liberation, like what about everybody else? To give a really quick rundown on why and I use the words that I root my work in Black liberation is because when we root our work in serving and supporting the people who are most harmed, we then help everyone. So if I were to say, let's try to help make sure that women get paid equally to men in the workplace. Well, if I make sure that all white women get paid equally to men in the workplace, then I haven't actually addressed the issue where Black women are not paid equally. If I make sure that all Black women are paid equally to men in the workplace, guess what happens to white women? They also get paid equally in the workplace. So I root my work in Black liberation because when we root our work in meeting the needs, meeting the needs of the people who are most harmed, it also affects everyone else. This is a lot of information I'm giving to you really quickly. I'm going to break it down a little bit more slowly as we go forward so you can kind of understand how I came to all of this. But last, I'm going to introduce you guys to my family. I'm a mom. I've got 2 little people. That's them right there. We just got our Christmas pictures back, so you guys are seeing it before the Christmas card. Okay, some ground rules and expectations that I try to, again, I'm just rolling really fast here at the beginning because I want to make sure we have time to get into the content. I am a therapist, and so the way I'm going to kind of facilitate the conversation today, I'll give you information, I'll do some lecture, but please feel free to participate, ask questions. Don't wait to just like a basic Q&A. I usually run things a little bit closer to like a group facilitation, so feel free to just chime in with your thoughts and things. So again, what I want to make sure I'm clear about on the front end is that I'm not a neutral person. I'm not going to pretend like I'm a neutral person or anything like that. There's really no Neutrality is not real, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more here in a second. And I also have no intention of like changing anyone's mind. I'm not standing here of like, hey, this is what it is, this is how you should think, and this is who you should be. If at the end of the day you don't agree with anything that I said today, like I'm totally cool with that. If you want to ask me questions and further understand why I came to the conclusions that I've come to, happy to have those conversations, but I'm not here to like convince anyone to believe a certain thing. I'm here to share with you a perspective, how I come to understand the work, the research and information that I've curated. I'm here to share that with you, but I'm not here to like convince anybody that they need to believe any certain thing. And I'm going to ask that because there might be opportunities where people share out like thoughts, experiences, that we just have a general respect for each other's experiences throughout our conversation today. We can also disagree without debate because, again, we're not here going to change anybody's mind from believing one way to another for the most part. However somebody believes, actually, like those conversations further entrench people into their belief. It doesn't actually help us to have positive dialogue where someone would change their mind. So it just becomes a big frustration battle without a purpose. And then last, I'm just going to ask that you have some sense of confidentiality. I know this is being streamed. I know there's like multiple people in the room, but just don't leave the room and be like, oh, you know what so-and-so said? They shared this story. Just if you could, please, just be considerate of the people around you who are being vulnerable enough to share their perspective and understanding. Any questions so far? Okay, that's all my groundwork stuff. Let's dive in. White is normal. Normal is white. How does that feel for y'all? For me to say that, white is normal. Does that feel like, yes, right? Yes, of course? Does that feel like, I don't like that? I'm going to be a therapist. I'm going to ask you to hold it in your body, this idea that white is normal. What comes up for you? Are you feeling some kind of way? Notice the feeling, where it shows up in your body, how you sense it. If it makes you feel agitated or like defensive, notice those things. I'm going to talk a lot today, really grounded in this idea that white is normal. So you're going to hear it a couple of times. So let's start by talking about what whiteness is. If you guys haven't listened, if I could offer you a recommendation for any materials to consume outside of this time, something that I think is really helpful, there's a podcast series, Seeing White. It's done by Scene on Radio, SCENE on Radio. It's free and available on like Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It's a podcast series, Seeing White. And in it, there's several episodes, and it kind of goes over the history of how whiteness came to be. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of that here today. So a lot of times when I say whiteness, people have a reaction of feeling like you're talking about me, the person. And yes, there are white people, but I'm going to talk to you guys today about whiteness as a philosophy, as a perspective, as a cultural, socio-political, cultural way of seeing the world, and not simply just as white people. There's whiteness as a cultural concept also. When blackness was created, so was whiteness. So this is Christopher Columbus. When Christopher Columbus and crew came upon new lands, when they were visiting Africa, they had this idea they wanted to take people and enslave them and use them for subjugation so that they could create wealth and build capital using slave labor. Well, they needed to come up with an excuse for why or how are we going to say that this group of people are worthy or not worthy enough and should be allowed to be subjugated. And so they created pseudosciences that we now identify as pseudoscience about like skull shapes, and categorized people based on race groups. So we actually know in the science, there is no biological difference between black and white other than skin tone, no different than like hair color. That's what we know on a biological level. But at the time, there was a need to say that this group of people can and should be subjugated, that we should be able to enslave them, to use their bodies for labor, to produce capital with them. And so it was a campaign, an intentional campaign to produce materials, to write books, to create research that that help affirm the idea that these black people, these African people, were less than human, not the same. They're black, so we can subjugate them, and there's no problem, there's no harm in doing that because they're not human like us. There's something different. In that moment, where there's an intentionality of making these Africans, these black people, this other, there is also an intentionality of creating whiteness. It's not spoken, but what they are doing in that moment is creating an us and a them. And you cannot create a them without also creating an us. So who are they saying is the us? In that they're creating whiteness. All of a sudden, they've decided that the people who are not subjugated, the people who are human, are white as a concept, and the people who are worth subjugating are black and other. So anytime, so sometimes you might hear someone say like, well, they're using the race card or they're bringing race into it. Well, the reality is that white people bring race into everything. If you see a board of an organization, a nonprofit, and the board is all white, no one looks at that and says, that's not appropriate. How come it's all just white people? But if you do see one and it's all black women, someone might be like, well, why is it that it's all black women? How come other perspectives aren't there? Who's not included? Because the normal of all white is just normal. White people are always operating on a race-based system all the time. It just operates as normal. And as long as it operates as normal, it gets to just be normal. And anybody who's doing something different is the other. So I hope today that you guys can come to understand a little bit more of how you are operating already in a maintaining of a system of whiteness. And you would actually have to be confrontational to that system in order to operate in a different way. So I'm actually going to come back to this idea of what did whiteness mean, because it's not been consistent across history. The idea of who is white has not been the same. But it was created, again, intentionally for the purpose of being able to say that this other group is an other and should not be included, is allowed to be enslaved, is allowed to be treated as less than human. We need a way to justify and say why that can happen. And so the idea of whiteness is in contrary to that, and it changes depending on the ways that power has to be at play. So you will hear people say, like, Irish people have not always been white in the United States. But as coalition grew and white people needed to make the pool of whiteness larger, well, it will include other groups of people so that it can maintain the power dynamics of white as the greater majority against the other. And so white has come to include other people, but it has not always been inclusive of everyone. So you can see this in, like, with Jewish people. Jewish people are not always white. In some systems and situations, Jewish people are seen as other, but when whiteness needs the numbers of Jewish people to be a part of it, well, then whiteness comes to include Jewish people. Queer people have not always been included in whiteness. Queer people were pushed outside of the community because they were queer, but as queer acceptance has become more mainstream, whiteness has looked to include queer people in its midst, but it has not always been inclusive of queer people. And so the way that whiteness shifts and changes to maintain a power balance. So again, we're not talking about a people so much as an ideology, and I'm going to break that down a little bit more here. I'm a therapist, and so sometimes I do these kind of workshops and education with other therapists. And I like to remind them that across the pond, there is a family that believes that they were bestowed by God with the responsibility of ruling over multiple lands all across the world, that they should colonize these lands, rule over them, that they are owed that by birthright. And we don't see that as a delusion. It's not a mental health disorder. It's just regular. Meanwhile, there are black men in Indianapolis who have a diagnosis of schizophrenia because they believe that the police are after them and the government hates them. Because whiteness is normal, and anybody else who is in confrontation to whiteness is the problem. But the ways that white culture operates and exists, it's the normal. Right now, if you wanted to go get something to eat, sure, there's great food out there, but can you go outside, find a tree, pick something, eat it, consume it? That's how you just live and exist? No, we've created a whole system of a way of existing in the world where you have to work and have labor to make money, to have money to go to a grocery store, to buy food. All of these systems and ways of living and existing, it's all one group, one population's imagination, and that's white men of a certain economic status. That's we all live to the reality of the world that they've created. Doesn't work for most of us, but we're all still living there. That's whiteness. That's whiteness. This is my family, again, with my grandmother-in-law, my husband's grandmother. She is 92. She lives in Terre Haute. We will see her for Thanksgiving. And I have this Lithuanian flag here. She is the only of her siblings who was born in the United States. The rest of her siblings were born in Lithuania. Her family immigrated here. My in-laws, do you think anyone in that family speaks Lithuanian? Nope. No one speaks Lithuanian. Why? Why don't they speak Lithuanian? What happened? Her parents they came from Lithuania. That was her first language. How come she doesn't have any recipes? She doesn't cook any foods? Because even white people recognize that you have to affirm the story of whiteness to be able to fit in. You can't be another and be included. They have lost their whole culture because whiteness took it from them. I hope that you guys come to understand from this conversation today that for white folks, fighting white supremacy is not about doing something kind for black and brown people. It's not a favor. It would be actually dismantling white supremacy because it's limiting your life. You are existing also in this limited paradigm for how we can exist and function as a society, as a community, by a single idea of what it means to have community and what community should look like, how it should operate. We are all beholden to that idea. I don't want you to look to reshape that idea to do a favor to black and brown people. I wanted you to do it so that you could learn about your own culture, rebuild community in a new way that you haven't been able to before, expand your community to connect with other people and have other ideas and ways of being. That would allow for other communities to be able to thrive how they need. If I use a similar example, like this exists across oppressive spectrums. So queer people don't necessarily need me to do something to help make it so that queer people can live more freely, except for me as a heterosexual person to not cause harm against them. You get what I'm saying? They need the people who are causing the harm to stop causing the harm, not for someone to do them a favor. And a lot of times, the ways that we look at doing anti-racist work is like, how can we do a favor for the black and brown people so that they're not having to experience hardship? Don't do a favor. Just actively try to stop the harm from happening. But that would shift the whole direction of where your work gets invested. Anybody have any questions? I feel like I sucked all the air out of the room. How y'all feeling? Okay. I know, like, my intentions today is really just to push your thinking into a different perspective and point of view. I know there might be a lot of like ruminating and thinking. So I'm a millennial. I try to integrate just different ways of learning into my stuff. So here's a TikTok that hopefully will help. Oh, can I have sound? Is there any way? No, it's okay. I'll tell you what she says. So in this video, this woman is crying, and it's a stitch. So that means this woman is crying and talking about how her family has kicked her out and won't allow her to come to a holiday gathering. And the stitch is that another person comes up as a black woman, and she talks about the ways that whiteness will push out members of its own community if you don't adhere to the rules of the white community. So all white people are kind of at a crossroads of having to to follow the rules for how the community has said that you have to exist. And if you somehow break the rules, then you will lose that sense of community as a punishment. So the closer you get to affirming a culture outside of how whiteness says that you have to be, then you get pushed out of community. And again, that's another way that whiteness actively hurts and harms white people, and why white people should be invested in the project of dismantling whiteness as a cultural concept and way of being for your own liberation. Because otherwise, you have to hold yourself, your family, everyone around you to these limited ideas of who you have to be. And it could be more broad, right? You could have blue hair. And in some families, if you come home with blue hair, that's reason for you not to be a part of the family. But like, why? Why are we holding on to those rules? Well, we hold on to those rules because we're going to go into that here just a second. Okay. So there's a workbook. It's called Dismantling Racism. You can find all this stuff like this. I try to use open access materials as much as possible. So you should be able to Google this, Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups by Kenneth Jones and Tima Akum. In this workbook, they break down they've done this research and looked at characteristics that white supremacy culture uses to maintain itself. So I want you to go back to this intentionality of we need to have an us and a them. We need to have like black people as them and not good. And we need to maintain this lie, because that's what it is. It's a falsehood. We're somehow trying to say that these people are not human. We all can know in the reality of right now, that was a lie. They were human the whole time. But they needed to tell the story that these people aren't human. They're less than human. They need to spread that propaganda and that message. That's the way we need to like create our society and function, because we need them to create the capital to earn us wealth. We need to have this free labor. We need to, that's the only way that we're going to sustain and overcome a British rule. So we need to be able to have that. So we need to have this propaganda campaign to make sure that everyone understands that these folks are less than human, so that we can have the capital, so that we can overcome British rule and become a dominant land worldwide. And so it uses certain characteristics to maintain this whole story, this lie. One of the things that I notice is like, when we go through this, what you'll notice is like some of these things, unfortunately, people have almost learned how to parent with them. So for a lot of white families, these are things that you get indoctrinated into even in childhood. So we're going to break them down individually. Let's start with perfectionism. Perfectionism, in my opinion, is one of the heaviest characteristics of white supremacy culture, and you'll see it weaved in all of these, but it very much affects the ways that when I'm doing therapy with folks. So, I mean, I'm just trying to switch sides because I feel like I've stood over there for a long time. Whew, okay. Perfectionism is this idea of you can't make mistakes. In white supremacy, we have to maintain this idea that mistakes can't happen. Pause, rewind, I just remembered. Let me make myself clear. Black and brown people also maintain characteristics of white supremacy culture because we are also indoctrinated into a society that is telling this story and this lie the whole time. And specifically, the ways that those come to be for black and brown people usually are a mechanism to keep ourselves safe. So maybe if I play the white supremacy game really well, it will be a tool so that I am kept safe by white supremacy, because then they won't see me as another. So if I play by its rules really well, then I won't be another and I won't be subjugated to all of the oppression that I see other black people having to experience. So perfectionism, mistakes are bad, should be avoided. Within white supremacy culture, there's usually a really low appreciation for reflection and like opportunities for personal growth. Like, no, if you say I did something wrong, you're saying that I'm not perfect, and that's bad. I can see by people's faces, me just saying that, like, you already see the problem with that too. Like, if I say like, hey, I didn't like how you did that, you're saying I'm not perfect. Why is that a problem? Why do you have a reaction to somebody saying that you're not perfect? What could you be? Who could you be? What relationships could you create? How could community be formed if you weren't afraid of sometimes being imperfect? Maybe. Did I mess it up? Okay. Sense of urgency. Within white supremacy, because of perfectionism, when we see a problem, well, we just need to fix that problem really quickly. We need to cover it up really fast and make sure it's not a thing anymore because we can't let anybody see that there happened to be an imperfection. That leaves very little time for let's reflect on why that imperfection existed. Why did we have that problem? Let's do some analysis there. Usually it's about fixing the imperfection so that it doesn't exist anymore because the urgency is on making sure that we're presenting something that doesn't have flaws. We could just own, hey, it's flawed. Dang, we just noticed that we're really weak in that area. We need to fix it. So we're going to spend some time understanding what made us weak there, why that was a weakness, or how we could improve. There's usually a sense of urgency that we need to fix it. And then if we've got lots of these to go through, but defensiveness. Again, tied to perfectionism, there's a defensiveness that you're calling out the fact that everything is not perfect, and that makes me feel like I need to protect myself because that's a danger to say that things are not perfect. And so you get a lot of responses to challenging white supremacy culture. You get a lot of defensiveness. Those are pretty obvious, but quantity over quality. So you get a lot of data-driven outcomes. Greater value is more important than feelings and emotion. And then I have capitalism, patriarchy, and disabilities. I'm going to go with that last bit to break that down a little bit. And then, so quantity over quality. One of the reasons that we see a lot of oppression against people who have disabilities is because they don't produce as much capital. People who have disabilities don't work and function in our society and build more capital, and so they have less value. Because everything is about more, not about depth, not about relationship, about production. How many people did you help or serve? How many people? Not how deep, not how well. Usually it's about bigger numbers. So you get a lot of efforts that are really data-driven. Well, when we see that a lot of people were served or a lot of people were helped, that has more value than the depth. We do a really poor job at a research level on even assessing and doing quantitative data analysis to understand depth over numbers. Data. There's a worship of the written word. A community that has existed for centuries. Anytime somebody gets a cold, they do this concoction of honey and onions and some other local herbs that has been serving this community for centuries. That's how everybody treats their colds. That's not real and valid in an appropriate way to treat colds until somebody comes along, researches that, puts some data behind it, and writes it in a book. Now we can say that that's a good treatment for colds. But we usually don't allow for people's stories, perspective, to be the way that we come to know what is truth. We have to know truth by data, what's written down. There's a whole slew of background of information that goes with that of who approves what's written down, how does that get published, who gets the funding for that. And so it really limits what we're all living to is just what's written down and what's been approved to be said as the law of the land. But who had access to say that? Because we all know, people live all over the world using all kinds of remedies and ways of living and that we could all benefit from. But until somebody goes there, researches it, writes it down, it's in a book, then we really don't usually have access to make that change the way that we exist and live. The stories of people having existed that way for centuries limits it. Paternalism, that those in power make the decisions and they inform everyone underneath them. Little to no information is passed between leadership and those under their influence. So that's just like that top-down way of leadership. Um, do you I personally, after having done some of this work of dismantling and unpacking these things, I have come to better understand, like, just because somebody's in leadership doesn't mean they're smarter. I mean, a lot of us that probably have a job where we've come to recognize just because somebody's in leadership doesn't mean that they're smarter. Actually, depending on where that person is in leadership, how they came to be in leadership, and where this other person is doing the work, the person who's doing the work might be the most informed person to make a decision. But when you have a paternalistic way of leading, when your organization is structured on these white supremacist ideas of like that person who's in power is the person who's in power and they inform everybody else and everybody follows directions, well, there's not even space for the person who's doing the direct work to say, like, actually, it would be better for us if we did it this way. Wouldn't that make the leader look good? If only. If only. Either or thinking that things are good, bad, right, wrong, you are with us or you are against us. There's very little room for the gray. As a therapist, I can tell you it is almost always both and. Very few things. I really want to say I can't think of anything that is either or, right or wrong, good, bad. Well, I won't go too philosophical on you. Things can be both and where this shows up is like, again, if you challenge something, if you question things, again, you are against. All of a sudden, you are against. These two, paternalism and either or, have been a real frustration of mine in the workplace because, to me, if someone is a direct worker or working more at the bottom of the totem pole and gives feedback, a lot of time the leadership can see that as like a threat and challenge to the leadership, but like, why would that person care to say that we could do something differently except that they actually think that the idea could benefit us? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, just like slowing it down. Why would someone who works somewhere be like, hey, I think it would be better if we did it this way? They have no reason to just be mean, to just try to tell the leadership that they're stupid. Most likely, they actually think the whole of the organization would benefit if we made these changes. So then what's the threat to listening to them? Okay, that's my soapbox real quick. Okay. There's a power hoarding. So those who are in power see that all as a threat because power is limited. They have to maintain that sense of power because that is what it means to be a leader under the context of white supremacy. And those that are in power feel threatened to change on the suggestions because it would threaten the power that they hold. So if I listen to the person who's at the front lines and says that we should be doing it this way, then everyone around might think that I'm not the smartest person in the room, and that is a threat to my power because that shows that I'm not perfect. I mean, okay, but do you see how very clearly this is not the structure or the way that it would have to be? We could perceive all of this very differently, but we'd have to do the work to perceive it differently, right? That means that sometimes someone's going to say something that's going to challenge our ego, and for a moment we're going to have to be like, that's making me feel some kind of way, but that just might be me. Let me work through that. Let me like process why that's upsetting me. Let me feel the feelings that are coming up with somebody offering me a new idea. That could be the work. But we'll get there. There's also a fear of open conflict because the fault lies in the person who creates the discomfort. So if you say, hey, I think that we should be doing things differently here, or I have an idea of another way we could do things, well, it becomes you disrupt this whole smooth selling group who was not going to question anything. Never mind that the idea that we were going with wasn't going to actually work for the good of most people in here. No one was questioning it or challenging it. It was all a smooth selling meeting. You said something and now everyone's trying to challenge it and say it should be a different way. You are the problem. You messed it up. I was like, this person might truly just be trying to help. Try to actually make the organization bigger, better, greater, whatever. And we lose that. we lose that to this fear of open conflict. There is an emphasis on being polite and niceness versus good, um, working for the majority of the people. There's also a focus on individualism, which is really handy because individualism helps to maintain isolated systems of people and make it about this individual person who is somehow imperfect. So raise my hand. Hey, I think that this way that we're doing things isn't working. I have an idea for how we could do it differently. Um, if the organization, if the group comes to agree, oh, they have a better idea, we should do that differently, then we find a fall guy for the last idea. They were the imperfect person who had the last idea, and we make it about them. It's like this individualism. So there's also fear in offering a new idea because if it's not perfect, everything will fall back on you as who messed up offering an idea that was imperfect. So this over individualism just leads us to not having a systemic look at like, why were we going in a direction that wasn't inclusive of everyone? Maybe we all need to sit with that reality and explore how we came to do that or why we were going in that direction. Again, giving it time to have some reflection and understanding. Progress is bigger and more. Little consideration for the cost of growth. Again, just more, bigger. It's kind of similar ideas of things I've already discussed today. As I mentioned at the very beginning, objectivity. There's this idea within white supremacy culture that someone can be objective. So I'm going to remove all of the emotions and we're just going to talk about the facts. Well, the reality is that we all come to every conversation with whoever we are and what our past experiences are. Those are always a part of the conversation. So no one's actually coming to it objective. If we go back to that idea of white as normal, what becomes even more apparent is that objectivity often just means white. We're going to go back to the white way of seeing everything and call that objective. It's not. And so then then it becomes an argument about objectivity, and it just gets really muddied, and so it just makes it difficult to even have any of the conversations. A right to comfort, ensuring that that people who are in power are comfortable, and places blame on anyone who causes that discomfort, similar to what I was discussing before. Everyone is supposed to feel good, and if you make me not feel good, that is a threat on who I am, which is very different from actually causing someone harm. Hurt feelings isn't necessarily harm. And sometimes our feelings get hurt. And I like to say that's a feelable feeling. You can just feel it, the hurt. So going back to, okay, how y'all feel? That was a lot. Those are the characteristics of white supremacy culture. Any questions before I jump forward? How are y'all feeling? Okay. So again, we're not talking about simply a race of people. We're talking about an ideology of white supremacy. We're talking about the ways that we exist and live in the world are shaped by this idea of whiteness as normal. Everything else, everybody else is something different. Again, just to give you guys some more concrete examples, the way someone dresses. If it's a cultural way of dressing that's seen as different, other, whereas the way white people do and say live, exist is normal. What a family looks like. Often, like how a home, do grandparents live in the home? Do grandparents not live in the home? How responsibility of taking care of children happens. If aunts and uncles are involved, if neighbors are involved, to what extent, all of that way of existing and operating as a family is a white ideal way, a white cultural way of how to understand family, and everyone else is everyone else is forced to maintain that. If you don't, as a social worker, depending on what that looks like, you could have a case. You sleep with your child. That's not the way that whiteness says that you're supposed to function as a family. And there might be a DCS case because the way you guys are operating and functioning in your household is not in line with how whiteness says that you're supposed to be living. We're all kind of living to that rule. So I want to make sure that you guys understand that we're talking about a violent political structure, a socio-political ideology, and a belief system that shapes every aspect of how we live. And so getting to this idea, so that's all of my background information to really get you guys to understand this idea that if you're going to do anti-oppressive anything, anti-racism anything, the work has to be on understanding your version of normal to a level of also recognizing when you are holding other people or policing other people to that idea of normal, and how you can expand what normal is in your space to allow for other perspectives, ideas, and existences to also be included. Because usually what happens, a story I like to give is, my hair is nicely tucked away in this ponytail here, but you've seen in the other pictures, I usually have like kind of large curly hair. That's how it naturally grows out of my head. I don't have to do anything special. That's just how it grows. And when I worked in academia, I always hated going to graduation, which was part of what you have to do as a professor, because the graduation cap doesn't fit on my hair. It doesn't. And the graduation cap doesn't fit on my hair because at the time when graduation caps were created, no one was expecting a black girl to walk across the stage. That's just the reality. So the function of that hat doesn't fit and work on my hair. Now, there have been some amazing black women who have created an invention. They've created a product where you put it inside of the cap and it turns into a headband so that we can wear it on top of our hair without having to chemically straighten it or go through a process of having our hair straightened just so that we could do graduation. But none of that changes the reality that it's still a cap that isn't meant to function for everybody. And as much as we might make adaptations so that we can fit into that space has done absolutely nothing to make itself more inclusive to us. And so usually the way that people go about doing anti-racist work is, well, let's see how we can help the black and brown people so they can be more included in this space. Never actually doing any work on addressing, analyzing, assessing, unpacking the space to figure out why aren't more black and brown people here? What are we doing? How are we functioning? How are we existing that make it less inclusive? Because that's the real reason that you don't have more people of color included, is because the space isn't inclusive. Not because black and brown people somehow need to be adapted and changed to fit into your space. Do you see how that automatically plays right into the ideas of racism as they exist anyway? Because you're asking black and brown people to do all the work to then fit into your white space. But the white space is not doing anything to adapt and change to include other people. So, like I said, we have to unpack our own ideas of normal. What culture and communities are you a part of? And what are their ideas of normal? One should be reflective of these things. How do you view people who exist outside of your ideas of normal? So when you see people who function differently, you might have a reaction. Now here's where like all my therapist stuff comes up. If I'm trying to come up with an example that's like not too high on the controversial level or won't shake the table too much. If I was parented with really heavy purity culture ideas about dating and relationships, and maybe even I got punished one time because someone saw me holding hands with a boy, and I got in trouble, and my parents like punished me. And so I was taught very clearly in my childhood that like you do not do that, that's not okay. Well, when I come across someone who was a teen mom, guess what my brain's going to do? Yep, I'm going to have all of these judgments about who they are, how they exist, how they came to be a teen mom, because of the experiences that I had, because of the stories that I was told. And so if I'm going to come to an understanding to be able to accept them, it might mean I have to go back to myself and be like, you know what? It wasn't that bad that I was holding somebody's hand. I wasn't like doing the worst thing. I wasn't a bad person. I wasn't a terrible person because I did that. And I can give that back to myself. That work is what's actually going to be required if I'm ever going to actually be more inclusive and be able to see the humanity in somebody who had a kid as a teen. It's not going to just be like, oh, I'm just going to do that. You got to unpack the stuff that's on the inside for why you are not, why you have a judgment about people who live and exist differently from you. We were talking over here earlier, and I gave the example that a lot of times when I'm working with men who have, as a therapist, this is kind of what I help people unpack, this kind of stuff. But I might work with a man who has these ideas that's having conflict with his wife. They come for like marriage counseling, and in the conversation, he has like a really strong, really strict ideas about what a woman is supposed to do and what her role is in the household and what her responsibilities are, who she's supposed to be. And he absolutely cannot help with meals and do because those are women's tasks and jobs. And what we come to find out a lot of times is that his dad beat him because one time he was baking with his mom and she said that was use a queer slur. You know, that kid it was a little boy who got in trouble for doing feminine things. It's really hard to now see value in people who do feminine things because he was punished and experienced childhood trauma related to not doing feminine things. Women are less than. That's literally what people were raised to believe. You can't just, oh, I'm going to think totally differently now. You got to actually go and unearth why it is that you hold the beliefs that you do and how those beliefs are limiting and hurting other people around you. That is going to be the anti-racist work. It is great to have projects to include other people and bring them in, but if you haven't done the work of figuring out how you could harm them, then you're really just inviting them to a haunted house. Because at any point, all of everyone else's stuff is going to come out and harm them. They weren't coming there on purpose. When I do presentations for workplaces and they're like, we really want to hire more black and brown people. And something I have to often remind them is like, black and brown people talk. Everyone knows you don't want to work over there. It's racist at that place. People don't just make these things up. People know, like after a couple of people have an experience, everyone knows, like, you don't want to work there. There's quite a few women in the room. Do you know places and spaces that are not inclusive of women? Do other women tell you of like, you don't actually want to go, don't go to that bar, don't go to that restaurant, those group of guys, that workplace? You know that it's not inclusive. And again, calling on the women, if you have a place that's male dominated and they're like, we want more women here, and they change nothing about the ways that they function as an office, is it going to be a place for you to work? They just needed to get more, right? They'll bring in 5 new women and it's going to fix everything. No, like the actual organization would have to change and shift because there's a reason why it hasn't had women. Same thing is true here. If you notice that people are missing, the question should not be, oh, how do we go and get more of them? The question should be, what is it about our organization and our normals that we're maintaining that limit people from wanting to be included? How can we go about doing that work of changing that? A deeper question is, who benefits from the ideas of normal that you're currently advocating for? Does it increase access or does it limit it? I don't know if there's any other way to say that. We can advocate for better access and everything for folks, or look to expand our ideas of normal. But who is being included? Who is not being included? Does it increase access? And then lastly, we have to check our ego because that's what it usually comes up against. So if I have to change the way that I'm seeing the world and seeing how things are going, well, that challenges who I think I am and how. Let me give you an example. So in social work, there is this, we have to take a licensing test to get our license. And for years, like over 10 years, the licensing exam people wouldn't release the data broken down by age, gender, or race. But everyone knew just from conversation that like certain people are passing the test a lot more often than other people. So last summer, they finally released the data and it is stark. white women pass the test at like 88%, whereas I think black men pass it at like 38%. So there's a big difference. And the immediate response to that by a lot of social workers was, oh, well, we need to figure out how to help black and brown people to pass the test more often. Because there was a gradient of race. There was a gradient where if you're older, you passed it less often. If English wasn't your first language, you passed it less often. And so it was like, well, let's figure out how we can support all of these people so that they can pass the test more often. Here's where we do the anti-racist work. Because if a black person and a white person sit in the same classroom, receive the same lecture, and then go and take a test, and white people are passing it way more than black people, we have to look at all the other factors there, because science tells us black people and white people don't have a difference in intelligence. So what's going on here? So I was a part of a group who kind of pushed for, can we do a deeper examination for why we're seeing these differences in test scores? And what we found was that the test is written in a convention where social workers can apply to be a part of this convention to write the test questions. You have to fly yourself to DC for a week, go unpaid, write the test. So there you go, right there with an economic level of who's writing the test. When we look at the last 10 years who's written the test, it's been overwhelmingly white women who were sitting at the table passing the test. They have the highest pass rates. And when you look at the test questions, it's because they're written from the perspective of a white woman. So what they would ask, you walk into a family's home, this is a situation, what would you do first? And the answer is call the cops. Black men didn't choose that answer. It wasn't the safe choice for them. So they offered to diffuse the situation, or they had a different answer of the way they would approach the test. So what we actually see is that the problem is not with black people not understanding in the same way. It's that the test was created in the normal of whiteness, because white people were the ones who were creating it. And so now it's pretty open in black social work. Oh, you need to take the test. You have to take it like a white person. You have to pretend to be a white person while you take the test. And so then you're getting black social workers who not only know how to practice the ways that they practice, they also know how to translate all their practice back to whiteness, and then take what they learn in white spaces and translate it all back to blackness. All of that is unpaid labor, extra on top of the regular job. But that exists for every profession. If you are a nurse who mostly works in a hospital with people of color, your textbooks don't tell you what psoriasis looks like on black skin. You have to do both. You have to understand and learn both ways of existing. This is the extra work that black and brown people are doing, because our normal is not the normal. And so what we need white people to do is to dissemble, to dismantle, to take down from the mantle, right? From taking from the hierarchy, this idea of whiteness as normal, so the rest of us can also be included. But every time you're like, hey, can we add another picture so that we can see psoriasis in a different way? It's like a whole debate. A whole debate about why we already have it. It already exists. Like, there's just not even space. We need more white people to be doing the work of dismantling before just trying to figure out ways to include us. Like, move back. I was going somewhere on the check your ego, back to the testing thing. So here's the other thing. So when we get to this testing, we realize this is the reason why, hey, we just need to change the test. On a quick aside, I'll tell you, we have no validity. We have no research to affirm validity that people who pass the test practice any better or worse than people who don't also. There's no validity to any of that. But, people still have to pass this test. And so there's this effort in many states to change the test, or to offer free classes to help people be able to pass the test, just different efforts to try to respond to this issue. And what we are coming up against most often is people who say, well, I passed the test, and so I don't want other people to be able to get the credentials that I do if they don't do the same things that I had to do to get the credentials, because they believe that the test made them good. Do you get what I'm saying? When you've worked really hard to achieve letters behind your name to achieve recognition, and you believe you take that on as part of your person. I'm an accomplished person because I was able to do this. Now you're saying that other people are going to have access to it too without having to go through all the same hardship? Well, you're saying that other people also are deserving of what I worked really hard for? That feels like a threat to what they worked hard for. Now, we could have a whole conversation about maybe you shouldn't have had to do all those hoops to get it either, right? We could have that conversation. But a lot of people get stopped at the ego of how they have propped themselves up of what they believe makes them worthy and good. I followed the rules. I went to church every Sunday. I had 2.5 kids. I've been married for 45 years. I followed the rules. Everything worked. I feel resentful for the fact that other people you're saying that other people should also be able to be good if they don't follow the rules. And to that I ask, who said you had to follow all those rules? Who could you have been? What could you have done? What did you want to do, but that you felt like you were beholden to these rules or else you wouldn't be good enough? I will leave some of the pastoral parts to you. But even there, like, I feel extra affinity with being with you guys because I see it as a responsibility of the people who are part of the community to help. Um, so like, people who are part of the community have to help dismantle it. So it's a responsibility of mine as a cis person to help other cis people understand transphobia and to dismantle transphobia because like my work is not in liberating trans people. My work is in helping cis people learn how to stop harming trans people, right? So similarly, as someone of faith, as someone who also identifies as like a Christ follower, I see it as a responsibility that I have to say to y'all, what are we holding other people to and expecting of them of who they need to be? And are we policing them to those ideas? And we could do there's a whole conversation to have about policing people to biblical ideas being how we even come to have a cross. Okay. Um, yeah, okay, yeah. How do we even come to have a cross is because of policing people to a biblical idea of what we have to be, um, of what it's supposed to look like. So, yeah, we have to check our ego and do that work of dismantling all that stuff. Anybody have any questions about any of that stuff? Yes, please. Mm-hmm. 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 That everyone else is existing in the world, and it's not a smooth paved road for everyone. For a lot of people, it's a really rocky, bumpy road where they have to morph themselves to be able to fit into the space. Have to change their language, have to be conscious about what they're wearing, have to be constantly be measuring themselves. Where other people are just like present. Um, I love that for you. More of us would like to have the freedom to be in that space. How are you helping to allow for and hold space for other people being able to be there and to feel safe when they do? Yeah. So, yeah, did you want? Because you get to. Because you get to say something, and so you're using your ability to say something to say something. Yeah. Yeah. That's access that you have that I don't. Like I literally couldn't do that. So thank you. But I think that that's a really great example that again for a lot of white people the work is going to be in building community and dismantling negative ideas within white community. That's the work. It's not necessarily black and brown facing. It's within the community of white people. How can we look to challenge one another, hold each other accountable, and break down these limited ideas that are not allowing other people to be included? I think sometimes people want to jump to doing the inclusion work and like doing the work with Black and brown people, but it's never actually creating space for them in new spaces. It's just white people coming and joining Black and brown spaces and kind of Christopher Columbusing it. Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions? Yes, please. Yeah. Well, thank you. I hope, like I said, if I'm going to be in a space, then I need to think about who is not in the space and be intentional about, like, hey, I have the privilege and ability to talk about something. Let me make sure that I am bringing in like, we have to be doing the work of making ourselves more inclusive for them, or making this space more inclusive so that they can feel safe here. If I give another story I like to talk to people, another story I like to tell related to trans folks is like, I won't ask any other woman in here to identify with me, but like I have car tweezers because every once in a while, like I get a whisker or two and I pluck those in the car, and because, women get facial hair. And that's something that everybody doesn't talk about, but a whole lot of women get facial hair. And as I come to understand womanhood with facial hair and accept womanhood with facial hair, in this way, my liberation as a cishet woman with facial hair is tied to there being allowed womanhood with facial hair, womanhood that doesn't just look like one idea of womanhood. That also liberates me. So trans liberation is about my own safety. Sure, I would love for all my trans sisters to feel liberation and acceptance and all of those things. But I also need trans liberation for myself so that I don't feel so much shame about the fact that I get whiskers. So thank you for saying that. Any other thoughts, questions? Y'all are so quiet. I don't know if I terrified you, if you just think that was ridiculous or what. If you need me, I am very accessible. Feel free to reach out. I live right here in Indianapolis. I actually live like close to Glandon, near the OYO field, so I'm like down the street. Yeah. Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm happy to hear that. I hope that I can do that for you. Thanks, y'all. Okay, well.
Right there, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Can I join you for a second?
Yes, please.
First, can we say thank you? Charlotte, thank you so much.
Yeah.
A question from me, I think, hopefully on behalf of all of us, is you're talking largely to a group of white Christians who go here to Cross of Grace and who have started from the folks sitting here, our racial justice team, who hope to be doing this work. How, in what ways, would you recommend us going about that? How do we do the work of that unpacking, of that diving in, and doing it together in a space, in this kind of space, and in this kind of community?
Absolutely. So I would recommend like doing a look around of the ways that all of the happenings of your community function. And is it like a narrowed, sorry, I'm all over the place, but if I were to come in to service on Sunday and you didn't know that I was coming, right? It wasn't some planned event. Am I going to see myself reflected anywhere? Am I going to see my culture reflected anywhere? Doing the assessment and then changing of that before you have people who, like, you're going to have to first do that work internally. You guys are going to have to learn how to maybe worship in new ways or to have events and programs that look differently. And then it would attract other people if that's what you want to do. But the work would have to first be in understanding how it is that you guys are functioning and looking to, like I said, understand it, see if there's some things need to change, but doing more of an assessment first is what I would recommend.
Tools or resources you recommend for such an assessment?
Not so much for an assessment, but I would definitely suggest the podcast Seeing White. It's really accessible and easy to access. Like I said, open access. Listening to that, and then just again, I would my organizational part of my brain says is like go categorize like communication, worship, event. Like you have the restrooms, you have a gender neutral bathroom, which is awesome. Love it. At some point, there had to be a wait a minute, we don't have a place for anyone to go to the bathroom, and then a building for that. There has to be like a constant assessing of like, do we have chairs for people who maybe have a larger body? Do we have resources for these things and building for it on the front end before it's like a need for it? Mhm. Uh-huh. So, I mean, I'm a therapist, so I help people do that work like all the time. But I also believe that people can do that in community, right? So, like, if you have a table of people and you guys are talking through ideas, there's different perspectives that are just right there where other folks can help support one another. Of like, well, maybe who aren't we thinking about, or who's not included, and kind of providing that for one another. That requires a whole lot of vulnerability and community if you're able to like have that, because that means that people are going to have to feel comfortable admitting that they're imperfect in that group, and owning that. But let's take it all the way down to like like a marriage, a couple. In a lot of ways, like that's kind of a space where a lot of people do this work or can do this work, where you say like, I don't know if you notice, but you always leave your clothes right next to the laundry basket. Like those little examples are where somebody else is coming in and saying like, hey, I don't know if you're seeing yourself, but seeing you, it is causing this like harm, or it's not helping the whole of the system. And then can you receive that feedback, all of that. So you have to build community amongst other people who you can give feedback to and receive feedback from, and it can be this like reflective practice, and that not feel like a threatening activity, but like a friendship. I don't know if others here have friends who will tell them sometimes of like, okay, so I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't think you were right there. Like, I think that maybe you could have handled that differently. Some of us have friendships where we have space for that. Some of us have to learn how to build those kind of relationships where people can give us feedback and we can learn to that maybe we are the ones who need to make some changes. The other piece to that is consuming materials that come from different people's perspectives. I'm currently reading The Covenant of Water, which is it's like set in India and it has an Indian author. In that, I'm learning perspective by consuming materials written by somebody else. I'm seeing the world from a perspective that's different from mine. And sometimes being in the habit of seeing the world from other points of views that aren't in line with who you are can help you become more aware of the various points of views that might exist in a space. And so sometimes the actual, like, not sometimes, a lot of times, people need to be actively trying to learn how to take on perspectives of other people who aren't there in all spaces. Like who's missing, what else could be going on, what else is happening. And some of us just don't have to do that work, so we don't do that work all the time. Does that make sense? I hope that made sense. Yeah. This is where I call it, I borrow from Brene Brown. This is, to me, is a spiritual practice. The spiritual practice of seeing the world from varying perspectives and to try to understand the perspective of the world from other points of view, and to take that into consideration when I'm making choices and doing things. But that becomes the spiritual practice. Like there's an intentionality there behind seeing like who else is included or not included and how they could. That's something I have to go outside of myself to actually choose to do. To some extent, I will also asterisk that with, as a Black woman, I don't really have a lot of options to not do that. I always have to do that because my safety is dependent on it. So I have to be conscious and considerate of how people are going to perceive me as a Black woman, and I have to make adjustments to that for safety. So even if I might feel really passionate about something, I might temper my voice because that other person's going to read me as angry or mean. And so even as like a child, if you look at research with like young Black girls, they already know in like kindergarten, first grade, they already know how to uh, modulate themselves because they recognize that there's an outside perspective of who they are that might be different from how they actually experience the world, and they already make the adjustment for that. For other folks where the world accepts them as they are, they're not in the habit of having to modulate themselves. A lot of queer people who have known early on that there was something different about them might learn to perform in a ways that the world is going to be accepting of them because they know that that's going to be necessary for their safety. And then the unlearning for them is learning how to not be so considerate of how everybody else is perceiving them and to learn to just be bold in who they are absent that judgment, where other people have to learn how to take on the other perspectives and see how they're being perceived. I hope that made sense. Yeah. Yeah. I'm good. Do I do Santa Claus in my house? I do Santa Claus in my house. Like, is he a white guy? That's a good question. So Santa Claus is a white guy at my house, but Mrs. Claus is Black because that's what my family looks like. My kids haven't caught on to that. Uh, that's just like how our family dynamic looks. So that's just how we've done it. So haven't had a challenge it. I grew up with Santa Claus, and I don't know. I don't think I questioned it too much. Once I did learn, the way my family kind of taught me was like um, that Santa Claus was like a concept, an idea to like for community, and so he shows up in different ways for like different people. But that it was more of like he was a symbol for building community in the holidays. But yes, no problem. Was yes. Thank you. I appreciate that. Um, if for me, whenever I went to like DEI workshops and stuff, like I just didn't. I always felt like it was like information based, like, hey, you can, and like steps. And then people would go home and be like, okay, so I'm going to do step 1, step 2, step 3, boxes checked. I did the DEI, right? And like, I, I just don't know that like actual change can happen if we're like box checking. It has to be a little bit more of an organic understanding our community and making adjustments. And so thank you. That's really helpful for me because I feel like I'm giving people philosophy and then like, are they going to walk away like I have nothing to chew on? So I'm happy to know that you guys feel like you got something to actually chew on, not just philosophy.
Charla, once again, thank you.
Thank you.
I think two things, and I would venture to say a lot of us in the room. One is to think of how this could be a haunted house for folks, how our synod, how our denomination has been a haunted house, how our harms have harmed folks who are different from those who look like me and have come into this place or have been scared to come into this place. And so I think that's one thing that we'll certainly reflect on. as you went through the marks of culture of white supremacy, at least I sat there thinking a lot of those resonate, or I felt them, and you made me sit with those feelings. And I thank you and don't like you for both of those things. But one thing that I hope here at Cross of Grace that we are more accustomed to push back is this either-or thinking. That we know here that we're both saint and sinners. That at the same time we have been given grace, and at the same time we still mess up. We are doing the work, trying to do the work of anti-racism, but you are very good, Charla, but we will walk out of this room and still benefit from the systems and cultures of white supremacy. That work won't stop. It is a both and for us. And so if you want to continue to do that work and to join us in that journey, I invite you to do that. We're trying hard. And some of us have been doing this for many years in this place. Some of us have just started. And so if you are interested, looking for a community and a place to do that, I invite you to join us and for this to be that place in that community. We're looking for ways to learn how to do this, to put on more events, to learn more, to do the self-analysis, the assessments, the work that has to be done. One opportunity I want to highlight most of all tonight is coming up on Saturday. We have a different organization, Child Advocates, is coming in and leading and interrupting racism for children. You can see on your tables that information. We have about half of that group filled up. So there's plenty of space, and we want as many young people as we can to be there. If you have neighbors, you have friends, you have families with young people, I can't encourage this enough. Please, spread that word. Secondly, we want to know how tonight went. And so we've got some surveys just to say, how was this? What'd you learn? What could we have done better? What do you want moving forward? And if you want to join and be a part of this journey and this work, put your name down so that we can at least add you to the racial justice email list. It doesn't have to be everything for Cross of Grace. We're not saying to come right in and be a partner in mission, but it does mean that we want you in for this work. And if you're looking for a community, it can be here. Lastly, there's some thank yous that we have to acknowledge. All of this would not have happened if it weren't for Francia Kissel. She's been the primary organizer of our racial justice team. She also wrote the grant and made all of the organizing happen for this event. So Francia, thank you so much for your leadership, your organizing, your writing, all the ways that you have used your gifts and talents in this place and in this way. Thank you. For all the folks who have helped, who brought food, who helped set up, who made all of the logistics behind the scenes happen, thank you very much. And most of all, thank you to Charla Yearwood for coming out this way, for joining us, for taking 2 hours out of your evening to help us do the work that we know we need to do. So thanks for that. On your tables, there is a QR code that if you are savvy with your phone or tech and you want to take this survey on your phone, you can do that just by scanning that QR code that's on there. We'll pass these out. I encourage you to stay in here and fill these out and then turn them in on your way out the door. There's plenty still of refreshments and things to grab on your way out. Feel free to hang out, socialize. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Have a good evening.